That's Jim Bell from the Pew Research Centre. Listening to that are the theologian and philosopher Elaine Storkey, Michael Nugent from Atheism Ireland, Professor Tina Beattie is a prominent Catholic thinker, and the poet and theologian Padraig O Tuama joins us in studio. Michael, good morning, and good morning to you all. Firstly, Michael, to yourself, what do you think of the survey?
Well, there's a lot of studies collated most recently by Phil Zuckerman, the social scientist, to show that the relationship between atheism and secularism is that atheists and secularists are less nationalistic, less prejudiced, less anti-Semitic, less racist, less dogmatic, less ethnocentric, less authoritarian, and more tolerant and more supportive of equality. And also that societies that are strongly secular have better results in terms of crime rates. If you take, for example, those 40 countries that were studied in that particular survey, in the countries where there are 3/4 or more people believing that God is needed for morality, you are more than 10 times likely to get murdered than in the countries where less than 1/4 of people believe that God is needed for morality. And there are so many examples that show in terms of empirical research that the more democratic and the more economically advanced and the more a society invests in education and health and communications technology, that people become more moral, and it's not because of God, but in fact it's the opposite, that religion is not only not needed for morality, but that it actively corrupts morality.
Corrupts it? You're saying if you have a belief in God, you're more susceptible to murder? Surely that's a huge statement to make, Michael.
Well, it's a statement that the empirical research backs up, not that a particular individual is, but that in a country where most people believe that morality comes from God, that you are more likely to get murdered. And if you think about it, morality is, if you imagine for a second that there's no God, and you look at morality in terms of compassion and empathy and reciprocity and cooperation, and as a natural function of our brains that has evolved in the brains of social animals, because both cooperation and competition help us to survive, then you add religion into the mix. What religion does is it says, here are things that, even if they do seem to be the fair and just thing to do, you shouldn't do them because somebody wrote in a book 2,000 years ago that you have to stone somebody to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, or stone a woman to death for not being a virgin on her wedding night. And it's pretty clear to us that we can see the distinction between those things and the good things, for example, in the Bible, like the story of the Good Samaritan, or love your neighbour as yourself. And by making that distinction, it's quite clear that we are applying our own morality to what we're reading in these books, not getting our morality from them.
Elaine, how would you have filled the survey in?
Oh, I would have said that I believed in God, and I believed that it's not necessarily that you have to have a belief in God in order to be moral, but you have to understand what morality is, and where do we get our concept of what morality is from. So I think the wonderful kind of advert for humanism and atheism we've just heard, okay, fine. Where are all the humanist soup kitchens? Where are the humanist street pastors who are going along the down and outs and sleeping in the gutters with people who have got drug problems and so on? Frankly, I don't see them. So I think that kind of explanation lacks coherence. I would have answered it in this way. I would have said, of course, many people live out what one might call a moral life because of who they are, because they believe that this is the best way to treat their fellow human beings. But that in itself, that very concept, is actually a biblical concept, a Christian concept. It says people made in the image of God have the capacity to actually live for others. And it's following out the whole rule of neighbour love, which is soaked through religion, all religions, but of course comes to its zenith in Christianity.
Tina, do you find in life that you need God to be good?
Myself.
Tina?
Needing God to be good. I think it's a much deeper, more complex thing. I mean, that atrocious little summary that Michael just gave of research is really so distorted in its understanding of what drives people to violence and crime. Let's talk economics rather than religion. You know, atheism is very good at masking the deeper political problems. Stalinism wasn't the most moral regime to live in, but I really don't want to get involved in a tit-for-tat about people who believe in God are better or worse. It also leads us to a very arrogant, Eurocentric view if we go down that road.
But he would probably trump your Stalinism with his Borgias and Taliban.
Well, sure, my point is that people who believe in God can do very good and very bad things, and so do people who don't believe in God. I think we've got to look more at public discourse. In countries where speaking about God is very much part of the public sphere, as it is in the United States, people are likely to have a framework that assumes belief in God is associated with all sorts of things that they take to be good and right and normal. In societies where we're more used to a privatised religious discourse and to relating to each other in very plural contexts, we're probably going to have more complex views of where our moral values come from. But each of us in the end has to take responsibility for what we do and why. And I think, for example, of Albert Camus' wonderful novel, The Plague, which is an amazing novel about atheist morality and its saintliness, if I can use that word. But when I hear people like Michael Nugent speak, I don't hear that deeply philosophical appreciation of how morality can spring from atheist despair as much as it can spring from Christian hope, say.
Michael, your atheism is simplistic. Where are the atheist food kitchens?
Well, if you look at the Red Cross, which is a secular organisation, Doctors Without Frontiers, Foundation Beyond Belief, there are any number of organisations that religious people don't seem to think exist, or that mistakenly assume are religious, that are secular organisations that promote morality because it is a natural process and natural function of our brains. That we, not just humans, but non-human animals display morality on an ongoing basis because cooperation as well as competition are useful attributes for survival.
And it's not morality. It's not morality.
Of course it's morality.
It's instinctive.
Of course it's morality. Morality is about how we minimise unnecessary suffering in other sentient beings and ourselves, and how we maximise well-being. If there were no change,
Prides of Lions, do you?
Of course you do. There are many examples of animals, rats in cages refusing to push a lever that will give them food if they know that it will cause another rat to get an electric shock. A monkey who had learned to get food by putting a token in the...
Morality is about freedom and rationality, and animals may do many things to ensure the survival of their species.
But we are animals. Humans are animals.
Well, we're animals with certain qualities
exactly,
that no other animal has.
Hear each other out. Let me bring Padraig in at this stage. Padraig, good morning to you here in Belfast. Aside from these debates that our guests are taking us into, the striking feature of the research seems to be that the richer we get, the less we need the old beliefs.
Well, I suppose one of the things that I think that the research does is it doesn't say who is more moral than others. It asks how do people justify or explain the source of morality. And that's a much more subtle question. In theological terms, it's a question to do with hermeneutics, really, as opposed to the quality. I used to do a lot of work in schools. I remember once talking in a school in West Belfast, and I asked young people, do you need to believe in God for to believe in forgiveness? And we had a subtle debate, what is forgiveness, etc. And then I asked the young people, do you think that religious people are more forgiving? And they laughed at me and they went, absolutely not, of course not. So there's a really important distinction to be made between the attribution of the source of morality and the practice of morality. And I think that's something that really needs to be careful, because if we try to say, if you believe in this way, you're going to be more moral than people who believe in that way, we're just playing games of tribalism.
Do you think modern religion, Padraig, has a philosophical offer?
I absolutely do, but I think there's a really important and subtle and nuanced debate to be had between people who have a moral offer based on their religious belief and people who have a moral offer based on their humanist belief.
What is the religious offer?
I think one of the things that I love from the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is the constant questioning of who is at the edges of the way we tell the story. And there is an evolution in that. And that's what I love about religion, is that religion, as you look at the subtlety of the text in Hebrew and Christian sources, is constantly asking people to be open to the possibility of change. Repentance, metanoia, change your mind, change your actions. And there is an evolution of belief. What was considered moral in the earliest times, when some of the earliest texts were written, was not considered moral as the text progressed. And I think that is where it demonstrates the evolution of human understanding of morality.
Elaine, what do you believe, though, to be this specific about theistic morality?
I believe what is specific is the whole concept of love, that morality hinges on neighbour love, on filial love, of marital love, and all of that has its denizen love for God.
But hold on, where does Michael then get love like that, and people like him?
Where does he get love like what?
Like the love you've just described. He probably has a lot of that love.
Oh, yes, but of course, because he's a human being, and Christian theism believes that human beings are made in the very likeness of a God who is love, and therefore they can't help themselves but love. And so we would expect loving behaviour from human beings. We would expect sacrificial behaviour, and we get it. You know, we see stories of people diving into lakes to save drowning children and themselves ending up dead, drowned. Why do they do it? Is it in their self-interest? No, of course it's not. It's something to do with the deep compassion within humanity.
And yet, Tina, isn't it funny how things change in front of our very eyes? Take, for example, this current Pope, the whole question of gay people. Who am I to judge? Says the Pope. He's a relativist these days.
I don't think, excuse me, I don't think he's a relativist. I think he has realised that there is a huge gulf between the changing morality of modern secular cultures and the Church's teaching, and many, many Catholics are affected and persuaded by that changing morality. I think there's much more to religion than morals. And we need to appreciate that whole textured dimension of life that faith in God brings in. But we can't sort of objectivise it in terms of who's better and who's worse. And I think the Pew Forum is clear they're not trying to do that. But I would just say that one of the things I wouldn't mind seeing back in our Western neoliberal societies is a sense of being held accountable after death for what we've done. You know, don't you wish that bankers were a little more afraid of going to hell than they actually are? You know, again, if we say we're a much more moral society, we are more liberal and perhaps more individualistic in our sexual and personal ethics. But in our social and political ethics, where are we heading to? And here maybe we do see the loss of a sense of healthy judgment about I'm accountable for what I do to others in this life and I'm not going to wriggle out of that.
Michael, surely you must cede something to the current Pope. Over the weekend even he says to the mafia, don't be doing what you're doing or you will go to hell. Have you time for Pope Francis?
Well, he certainly seems to present things using nicer words, but he hasn't changed any of the discrimination that the Catholic Church has done. He hasn't turned over the criminals and child rapists that the Vatican has been sheltering for decades. And if he started to do things like that, then it might be possible to see things a little more compassionately in terms of his approach. But the thing about the Catholic Church is that the demographics of the Catholic Church is that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the Catholic Church members are now based in the third world. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, where the Catholic religion is much more dogmatic, is much more superstitious, much more likely to believe in miracles, in possessions and things like that. So the Catholic Church is going to be becoming more fundamentalist rather than less in the coming decades.
Do you have kids, Michael? A personal question. Do you have kids?
I don't know.
No, well, what do you base your world on then? Without religious teaching or tablets of stone, where are your points of reference?
Well, my points of reference are compassion and empathy and reciprocity and fairness and justice and cooperation.
Where do we get those things? What is it in the human being? I guess here would say that is the being of God. That's the likeness of God in humanity.
Well, of course it's not, because if you take what the religions say, that they do include that by coincidence, but they also include things like torture. Religious people are more likely to support torture of terrorist suspects, and the more deeply religious you are, the more likely you are to support torture. Religious people are more likely to support prison as retribution. Religious people are more likely to support the death penalty. Religious people are less likely to support gender equality, gay rights, and less likely to be politically tolerant. So there are a range of areas where empirical studies have shown that secular societies are more tolerant and more moral than religious societies.
Elaine, where do you want to start there?
Well, they're just a sweeping set of generalisations that actually make...
It's based on empirical research. It's
Michael,
not generalisations.
let Elaine have her say, please.
There is no empirical research that gives out those largely banal attributations.
Of course there is.
Basically, and what you talk about secular societies, you see. So, for example, you just mentioned the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières and a whole range of others. I could mention all of those too, but just because they're not religious, in other words, they don't have a Christian or a Jewish or Islamic foundation, doesn't mean that people within them don't believe in God and are not acting from a morality that is informed. And the discourse which is framed and shaped because they believe in God. So you've even misused the word secular. You're using it in different ways. Sometimes you're using it to mean atheist, sometimes you're using it to mean non-religious or not religiously affiliated and so on. So there's a whole range of things going on in your own discourse and your own reporting back, which are actually two big concepts and multiple concepts used together to make what you're saying that helps.
Okay, Padraig O Tuama.
I think, unfortunately, what this conversation can also often turn into is a question about, is it better to be religious or not to be religious? And I think there could be some really interesting collaboration found between people coming from a whole variety of perspectives on this question, saying, what are some questions of accountability that we can hold ourselves to? And there are some similar ways, questions to do with equity, questions to do with economics, questions to do with privilege and power and access to opportunity and access to freedom of choice. All of these things, I think, are things that we all can approach for different motivations, but we can approach these significant questions seriously. I really like the character of Jesus of Nazareth because so much of his engagement with society was by asking really uncomfortable questions and not providing easy answers. But I understand that there's other people who will arrive at those very same questions through a different philosophy, but we can find some really interesting common ground instead of what can often descend into tribal conversations as to whether it's better to be an atheist or a secular or a religious person of this stripe or a religious person of that stripe. None of that is particularly fruitful.
Tina, do you ever wonder what kind of a person you would be if you weren't a believer?
Yes, I do, because I think, excuse me, that's the only way we can have this kind of conversation where, excuse me, in my life, does this faith help me to understand myself, to judge myself? You know, I hear in Michael a great deal of sweeping condemnation and judgment of others, verging on a very dangerous kind of, dare I say, almost European racism, that, you know, Catholicism is going to become more fundamentalist because look at all those Africans. I mean, that's just appalling. What we have to do is to say, in my life, how do I take responsibility for who I am, how I repent and how I grow? And I think that's the only way we can measure what faith really does to an individual life, only in terms of, am I better because I'm an atheist? Am I better because I'm a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew? I know what I would be without this dimension of my life, I think,
but Elaine,
and I value it.
Elaine, if you set aside your faith in the morning, like so many people are doing these days, educated people, people from all strata of society, do you wonder what kind of a person you would be tomorrow if you set your faith aside?
I couldn't set my faith aside. It defines who I am. And frankly, my education, every bit of education I have, deepens my faith. It also, of course, deepens the questions that are there surrounding my faith. But I know the tendencies within me which are there to be repented of, and the tendencies to self-interest and self-centeredness and judgmentalism and intolerance and impatience and all of those kinds of things, and unfairness. And I see them writ large in our culture, and I know what they are like to live with because they're not a million miles from my own heart. So it's not that you're a smug, self-centered being when you're a Christian person. You're actually terribly aware of the limitations that you have. And just enormously grateful for God for having taken you on.
Michael, you give us
a journey with you.
Sorry, Elaine. Michael, you give us an impressive list there in terms of your own polemic a moment ago. Let me trumpet or attempt to with the wonders of Judeo-Christian literature, Wilberforce, fair trade. As we speak, Irish Presbyterians will be digging wells in Africa, Victorian England, and what it gave the world, Quakers and their industrial communities and the Industrial Revolution, and that list goes on equally, Michael, parallel to your own.
Of course it does, and I just need to respond for a second to the suggestion that I'm being racist, because that's obviously quite a significant assertion to make, and particularly ironic to be made while simultaneously saying that I'm being judgmental. What I was saying was that the Catholic religion is becoming more fundamentalist because of the demographics of Catholicism. Now, if a religious person considers that to be a negative attribute of Catholicism, that it is adhering more to its own doctrine, then that's up to them to explain. But it was the idea of being racist by simply making observations on reality is strange. With regard to your point, Of course, religious people can be moral, but it is largely by coincidence if they're blaming, if they're attributing their morality to statements coming from a God that there's no evidence that exists. As the famous theologian on television, Homer Simpson, once said when Marge was trying to get him to go to mass, but what if we've picked the wrong religion? Every week we're just making God madder and madder. And that's the difficulty with religion and believing God is this God is apparently telling different people that different things are right and wrong, and so you have to have some independent criteria to decide which God you believe in.
Padraig, final word to yourself. You present every time you come into the studio as a genial, likeable chap. Those ethics, that morality, that sense that you've described on air today, it's accidental, says Michael.
Yes, well, I was going to respond to you, Michael. So I'll speak from my personal life. I am a theologian and a poet and a gay man, and I have experienced some of the most difficult and hurtful things from religious people, as well as some of the most beautiful and empowering things from religious people. And what I think is this is a question of hermeneutics. How do we use the moral framework we have? And I know atheists who have been absolutely insulting and atheists who have been absolutely affirming, and I know religious people who have been absolutely insulting and absolutely affirming. So it's a question of how you use the source of morality that you attribute, as opposed to whether the source of morality is more moral than somebody else's.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm afraid we must move on. I could talk to you till lunchtime, the four of you. Thank you indeed. The theologian and philosopher Elaine Storkey, Michael Nugent from Atheism Ireland, Professor Tina Beattie, and the poet and theologian here in studio in Belfast, Padraig O Tuama.